thank you for that appallingly indulgent set of applause. You might want to save that one for afterwards, because I'm now going to try and live up to that and look like I'm going to deserve it. But I'll do my level best. Thank you very much to Chris and Gemma for suggesting to Garrad and company that I come down and do this. They asked me very, very nicely if I wanted to come down and do a sort of Englishy, cultural studiesy type lecture to sort of follow the maths and science one that was apparently went on last year. And I said, all right then, and then they said, it's an hour and a half, and I said, is it too late for me to run and hide? So there were two ways that I could do this, and it was either going to be talk at you for 90 minutes and just watch as you all succumbed to the arms of Morpheus, or I could be slightly more engaging and put slightly less work in and say it was going to be a seminar. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to spiel for a bit, and then I'm going to stop and see if anyone wants to start an argument. And if
5 minutes or full half hour? I don't know, we're going to work that one out later.
Hitting all the head lessons is next.
Okay. So, what I have plucked out of the ether as a topic to talk about is, I want to talk about a potential link between the types of games that people play. As a lifelong gamer, I'm always interested in working out exactly why I spend so much of my life paralysed in front of screens or hunched over tiny tables, ruining my spine and vision, and the economic state of affairs. And what got me kicked off on this was, bizarrely enough, was an interview with singer-songwriter Andrew Eldritch, in which he opined about sort of 1998 it would have been, that, and in his words, I think this is one reason why football is so popular again. It's a game which the citizen can focus on, where the rules are defined, unlike his life. The citizen is becoming a pawn in a game where nobody knows the rules, where everybody consequently doubts that there are rules at all, and where the vocabulary has been diminished to such an extent that nobody is even sure what the game is all about. Arrayed against this increasingly befuddling state of real life, with its vast impersonal forces which no human being entirely understands or can entirely control, or indeed can stop, you have discrete, gameable systems that become more and more popular the more confusing real life gets. At least that's the theory, and I'm proposed to spend the next sort of half an hour or so striving to prove it. I'm going to open the floor and ask quickly for a sort of straw poll for reasons why people think we play games.
Escapism.
Who said escapism? Nice one, Garrad. Yeah?
So it's waste time.
As Bertrand Russell once said, the time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time.
No.
But to procrastinate, absolutely. So,
A friend of mine told me that World of Warcraft helped him during his divorce because he could just hide in Warcraft.
funnily enough, World of Warcraft helped me with my masters because I could just hide from my thesis for a month. So you probably are something with that one. I maintain that's the reason that I didn't actually get a distinction, is that I could have done, but unfortunately I started playing WoW right in the middle of thesis season, and that was me gone for 4 weeks. The least productive 4 weeks of my life.
Give to Daily Mail something to complain about.
Yes. Funnily enough, complaints are where we're going to be doing this eventually. So yeah, so you've got escapism, that sense of getting away from something in real life that's either going to cause you problems or that is causing you problems. And escapism is the one that often sort of surfaces. Author and academic China Millville of the Iron Dragon's, no, it's not the Iron Dragon's daughter, what am I talking about? Of,
The Dido Street Station.
thank you very much. I don't know why I always get these two mixed up, but anyway, Millville said in an article called Fantasy and Revolution that the problem with escapism is that when you read or write a book, society is in the chair with you. You can't escape your history or culture. So the idea that because fantasy books aren't about the real world, they therefore escape, is ridiculous. Fantasy is still written and read through the filters of social reality. Precisely because you read and write books with society in your head, the escape that Tolkien and others aspire to is doomed to fail. In fact, it's precisely the most escapist books that take the real world for granted, which are most shackled to thinly veiled and highly ideological, that's not a word you want to say this early in the morning, versions of that world. The problem with most genre fantasy, says Millville, is that it's not nearly fantastic enough. It is escapist, but it can't escape. Tolkien famously opined that in his opinion, as the mighty author, there was no allegory in The Lord of the Rings. And whilst I have the utmost respect for Professor Tolkien as a linguist and as a builder of worlds and as a genius for a sustained sense of the epic, I am forced to call shenanigans on the claim that there's no allegory in The Lord of the Rings, because 60-odd years of literary critics have been mining Tolkien for allegories of race and of class and of a sort of piteous cry against the Industrial Revolution, in which the worst thing that can happen to the world is that it ends up a little bit like Birmingham. I'm from the West Midlands and I can sort of see where he's coming from there, but... So, that notion that society is in the chair with us, I'm going to be coming back to that one later, and I'm going to apologise briefly as well, because we are going to venture into political territory. It's unavoidable when you start talking English literature, because Englit and its associated disciplines are the last places in the Western world where you will find the traditional Marxist alive and well. So I wish to hastily disclaim at this point that whilst I may talk Marxism, I am not for a nanosecond suggesting that the Marxist ideology actually works. Marx's model of how society works has been taken up by the humanities and run with as a critical sort of framework for thinking about literature and about the world, but that doesn't mean for a second that we actually think communism works. So, bit of a killer. Escapism. The idea that society is in the chair with us. Does anyone have any thoughts at this juncture about what that means?
Well, everybody's built by their own experiences, and society creates a large chunk of your experiences. So what was being said is there is no way to filter out. Even when you do aliens, they will be human. Yeah, that your aliens will be in some way influenced by somebody, by some idea about being human. When Terry Nation wrote The Daleks, he had the horrors of the Second World War and Nazi Germany in mind. Kit Pedler, as well as Kit Pedler and Jerry Davis, had their peculiar horror of, had a peculiar sort of Cold War mentality that informed the creation of the Cybermen. The other element to this is that, as well as people always writing what they know, people will never be able to write what they don't know. Lawrence Lessig, the free culture activist, argued quite early in his career, and quite persuasively to my mind, that it's one thing to say that everything has been said and done before, and that originality is dead, and quite another to ask if originality was ever there to begin with. From Lessig's point of view, everything that is written or said or created is an amalgamation of influences. So rather than sort of making up anything out of full cloth, what we do when we be creative is to assemble our influences, all the stuff that we've read and seen and never thought about in our lives, and to just jumble that about in a slightly different way, cut and paste it in a slightly different way, and possibly produce a new arrangement of it. It's like a deck of cards and shuffling and dealing out a poker hand and then shuffling it back in and dealing it out again. Same cards, different order. So saith Lessig. Again, whether or not I agree with this, I'm not entirely certain. But the idea being that when we create any sort of fictional world, we are in some way drawing upon or embedding that world in the reality that we created it from. We can move further away from it, we can do aliens, we can do a story where there's nothing, we can do a story without humans that's as far removed from the actual frames of reference as we can possibly make it, but the simple fact that we're writing it in our own language, which is in itself a social construct, means that society will always influence the texts that it produces. You've got the idea about escapism, and about sort of immersing yourself in a narrative, which is one reason people play games. But I quote at this point Scott Barber, who is a writer and extremely competitive wargamer from the United States. And Scott rejects the concept of escapism outright, vocally and with foul language aplenty. I've trimmed out I've trimmed out most of Scott's invective to try and leave the point that's buried underneath the layers of contempt, and it goes something like this. I play to have fun. I do not play to escape from my life. I love my life, and gaming is part of that life, not some separate pocket dimension full of freaks and mutants. When I'm playing, I often forget about other stuff as I concentrate on the game. That may seem like escapism to some of you, but to me, it's simply paying attention to the task at hand. It must really suck for the escapists when they go back to their miserable lives. Cut a sort of long and self-involved-ish feeling there. And then, for me, it's a game about fictitious elves, dragons, good guys, bad guys, and other stuff that should not be shared with your boss. You play the game in the real world with and against your chosen opponent. What Scott's saying and doing there is highlighting a distinction which divides wargamers and fantasy games the world over, which is the distinction between fluff and crunch, between story and mechanics. And the distaste that emerges amongst players who are focusing on the mechanics, focusing on playing games and winning games, and largely not wanting the story is nice, but the story is not sort of a motivating factor in why these people play the games. They would play the game if it wasn't fantasy, if it didn't have any sort of implicit narrative attached to it, purely for the sake of being good at it. The detachment from story there gives rise to two phenomena. You have the gamer as lifestyle choice, who is very, very committed to winning games, to learning games, to being good at games, to thinking about games. And the rules lawyer, who is committed to learning games inside out and upside down and proving themselves right with them, essentially playing the game as mechanically perfectly as possible. And as sort of case study for this, before I get into the explanation of why I think people play games this way, a case study that I want to look at is the miniatures game of Warhammer, which had its origins in the 80s as what developer Rick Priestley called a between work and the pub game. The idea being that you could come home from work about 5-ish, get a game of Warhammer in 2 hours, and still be down in the pub in time for last orders and a pie. At some point, the game drifted away from the idea of being something that could necessarily be slotted into everyday life, and was picked up by a competitive and very precise, very mechanistic tournament style of play. So it became something that you would go away and you'd play for 2 days solid, and at the end of the 2 days somebody would walk away and be able to say that they were the official best nerd for the weekend. The game is plagued by arguments, by imprecision, by disputes. It is not written with the care and attention and precision that, say, a legal document would be. It is manifestly ill-suited to the way that it's being played. And so it's experienced the sort of rise of system there. The game's background has made a move away from its sort of originally quite, I don't want to say nuanced fantasy world, because it's always been a bit silly and a bit exaggerated, but when it first appeared, there was a sense that people could get away with using the world creatively. Kim Newman wrote some of the earliest novels for the Warhammer universe, and several of them are quite biting if you squint critiques of, for instance, Thatcherism, that he based one of his villains on Michael Heseltine, and later would come back to base a villain on Tony Blair in the late 90s. But there was a drift away from this sort of using the world as social critique and using the world as kind of an interesting world to tell stories in its own right, and turning it into an excuse for everyone to be at war with each other all the time. So as the mechanics of the game become more prevalent in players' minds, the material that's produced for those players to consume becomes more focused on justifying the game and less focused on sort of building a functional world in its own right. The game also sort of move away from the idea that you'd have a games master who would deal with all the kludgy bits of mechanical rules for you, and you just have 2 people playing the game and concentrating on tactics and developing developing a story or whatever it is that they're trying to get out of the experience, towards, no, the rules are their own master, and everyone who's playing the wretched thing has to engage with them. So I see a shaking head.
Well, I play Warhammer, or I used to play Warhammer, I haven't played for a couple of years, and I set up a club called the Sad Muppet Society.
I think I've heard of it, yeah.
Which basically is a bunch of gamers who are there purely to have fun.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you play the game and you go, oh damn, I forgot to do that. And your opponent will just go, well, okay, it's out of sequence, just do it. We don't care. It's the whole ethos of the club is, if you're not having fun, if you want to be a lawyer's lawyer, go somewhere else, because we don't want you to.
Yeah, I think that's a great attitude to have, because I am firmly of the opinion that fluff and crunch can coexist with each other, and that just knowing the standards of the community you're going to engage with is probably the key to it. Is that if you know that everyone else is there to have fun, turning up your tournament list and your tournament hat on and your rule book that's got all the little bookmarks, the tricky bits in it, is probably not necessarily the way forward. But the fact that there's a debate at all, for every person who says, can we not just play the damn thing and have fun, there's a person who says, can we not just fix this damn rules system, because I'm sick to the back teeth of not being able to understand how multiple charges work. So the tension that exists is symptomatic of a different set of reasons for engaging with the game. But I definitely think that the tournament player emerges at some point during the mid-90s. Because the original, was it up until the second or third edition of the game that Warhammer still had a games master? I know the first edition of Warhammer 40k did. And the idea was that you'd have a rules.
Well, way back when I was playing, I was playing historical. Now, if you're talking historical wargaming, talk about rules lawyer. I've actually had units banned because they were wearing the wrong coloured green on their uniform. Sorry, they are not the 25th because the green's the wrong shade. You can't build them.
There are rivet counters everywhere.
Yeah, there are different types of players though that want different things out of gaming. I mean, I used to be a member of a club years ago called Satellite and Warlords, and we actually came up with names for gamers for amusement. And two of them were, one was winners, which was basically win at any cost, and the other one were toppers, who didn't necessarily want to win, but they always had the best of everything. And would trump you. Oh, have you seen my painted elephant? So I think people actually go into categories because they want to be in those categories.
Yeah, I think so. I think the only people I've ever seen cause significant trouble are the people who aren't sure what category they want to go into, I think. And so whenever they're in one, they'll play up the standards of the other because they're sort of surrounded by people who disagree with part of what they're espousing. The idea that people want to sort of come out on top and that want to win at all costs that kind of leads me into my next point, because I was talking about this sort of emergence of a competitive player, and that leads back into the quote that I opened this little tour de force with. The idea that the more confusing real life gets, the more people look around for something that's got rules that they can be sure and certain of. And so I can't help but wonder if the reaching out for a defined rule system, for a way for things to work, and you can say, no, that shouldn't work like that, it says it right here, is in some way slightly reassuring when you can't point to the rule book for real life. I don't know. But this is it's a theory, anyway. Yes?
Not a blokey theory, because all the people I know who are obsessive rules lawyers are men, and most of the people I know who are whatever are women. Most people, men and women, are in the middle somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I think these sort of extremes from either camp tend to be quite gendered examples.
Maybe we have a better rule book for
that. Or maybe you don't need one. Maybe you're just making it a whole lot as you go along.
Oh, well, yeah.
Is that
No. They have a rule, but we're just not allowed to know what it is. It's too complicated for us here.
Yeah?
I'm not sure I agree with you with life is getting more complicated. I think it's always been complicated.
Maybe. Yeah. I think I think it's always been complex. I think people notice it more when they're at the mercy of complexity. In times of economic hardship, when you're perhaps not quite sure why you have no money, and you can't quite pinpoint what it is that's making you have no money when you had money this time last year. I think that's what I mean, the sort of crisis point when people look around for something that they can understand and something that has a cause and effect in it. Life is always complex, but you notice it more in times of hardship, maybe.
But I mean, you know, if you go back a few hundred years, most people were in hardship most of the time, and they were at the mercy of, well, and as a lot of people are now, whether it rains, whether it doesn't rain, whether it rains at the right time, whether the volcano erupts.
Yeah.
They've got no control over anything at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they had
But they still had things that they would do for fun, which is...
I think we have no control and spare time, but you know, since like
Yeah.
farming,
You have the emergence of sort of regimented time during the Industrial Revolution, which helps. I think another part of it as well is that I think there is a difference between weather and economics, because economics, if you stop and think about it, we made this up. Whether it rains, whether it doesn't rain, whether the volcano erupts, they're down to things which were not created by human hand and not imagined by human thought. The volcano is going to erupt if it's time for the volcano to erupt. Whereas something like an economic system, it's an entire machinery of cognitive concepts. Things like money and cash value. If money disappeared tomorrow, the sun would rise on a world that has the same amount of physical stuff in it as ever. The only thing that would change is that this huge complicated system, which can somehow ruin our lives despite being increasingly tied up with things that don't exist, that only have a presence in the human mind, and yet have this extraordinary power to determine what happens to us.
So where does the tipping point come between being rules obsessed in games and going out on the streets and marching on the government?
I'm going to get to this, actually. You'll be glad I waited. You'll be glad we waited. But, Garrad?
To get Marion's point, I think there were something equivalent. Because, yes, the volcano is going to explode whether you like it or not, but we invented stories to explain it. And in some ways, we codified why our volcano was going to... There's a reason we chucked the Virgin Maiden into the volcano.
Yes.
Because we were creating rules to explain stuff that had no... we couldn't understand. So in the same way, we just did it in a different... Now we've got role-playing games, we roll dice, or we can play a computer game. In the old days, it was stories to explain why these things happened.
And so in the old days, there would be somebody out there trying to calculate the optimum number of maidens that have to be shoved down a volcano.
It's not in the same way that we do it now. But in the old days, that's the way they did it. But back before we had the Industrial Revolution, there was a bloke who always said, look, the rain's not happened. Right, we need to slaughter 20,000 people on top of this pyramid. That'll make it work.
Reminds me of that when we get to Dungeons and Dragons.
In the old days, we didn't have a lot of control, but we didn't have so many aspirations. There weren't things to aim for. People didn't go abroad for their holidays. They were lucky if they went down the road to the next village.
What is holiday? No, it's a day off, isn't it?
No, but do you know what I mean? When I was a child, everybody in my street had the same sort of aspirations for holidays. These days, you're living next door to somebody, you can't afford to go out for the day, but they go to Barbados. It makes you unsatisfied with what you've got.
I think so. I think you've absolutely got on something there. And I think again that sort of
there's too much being pushed at us that we can't have.
We shall drive onwards with that sort of point, with that point in mind. I'm going to quickly sort of race through something about non-competitive games for a second, and then I want to sort of pick up on this talk of economics and aspirations and rule systems from the old days, because it comes together into something that is either quite problematic when you think about gaming, or something that's sort of interesting, but you sort of say, well, yes, but what of it?
Sorry, you used the phrase non-competitive games.
Yeah.
I don't think there's such a thing.
Yeah,
Whereas non-competitive players.
Yeah.
Yes, I most certainly am a non-competitive player.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't care. If I go out and play a game of Warhammer, I don't care whether I win, lose, draw, whatever. All I want to do is spend 2-3 hours with somebody sat the other side having that conversation through the game.
Yeah.
You want to lose a game and lose over to a 4-year-old.
Yeah, I have in the past tried to argue the case for the existence of a non-competitive game, and I don't think there is such a thing myself.
I believe there are
role-playing games, not the tabletop.
I believe there are non-confrontational
Yes.
games because I mean, there are what Owen Cooper describes as things like Carcassonne and Settlers of Catan. Owen Cooper described them as non-confrontational Euro games with wooden blocks and the thinnest of things pasted on afterwards, such as being a carrot farmer in Amish, Pennsylvania, or a town planner in 17th century Lille, or some such nonsense. And with those games, they fall into, depending on whether or not, I mean, some people would say that without the element of competition against something, that a game is not a game. Computer game designer Chris Crawford attempted to define the term game using a series of dichotomies, saying that if it's made for its own sake, it's art. If it's made for money, it's entertainment. If a piece of entertainment is interactive, it's a plaything. If it's not, then it's something like a movie or a book. It's something that's passively consumed. I know a lot of fan fiction writers who would rise up and rabble at the thought of passive consumption of text, but for purposes of gaming, I think Crawford's onto something. He's building towards a definition of game, and I'm not going to dispute where he's going with that side of things. If no goals are associated with a plaything, it's a toy. And Crawford notes that by his definition, a toy can become a game element if the player makes up rules. And also that things like The Sims or SimCity are toys and not games because there isn't an inherent goal attached to them. They're something that runs for its own sake. If the plaything has goals, it's a challenge. If a challenge has no active agent against whom you compete, it's a puzzle. If there is one, it's a conflict.
So what you're saying then, for something like, I'm a games master for role-playing games, we play Pathfinder.
Yeah.
That is a puzzle because the idea is that the 6 players have fun,
Yeah.
and my thing is to keep them on edge but not to kill them.
Yeah.
Because if they die and they have to start again, they will not have fun.
They are, however, competing against an active agent. They're trying to stay alive.
Well, no, because my job is to not kill them, but almost kill them every turn,
But that's it.
every week.
But as a GM, your job is to make them think there's a risk of dying.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
without that air of the chance of dying, even though most of us rarely kill. Yeah, it's like a foreplay that never comes to an end.
If I
It's tantric gaming.
Over the 2 years that we have been playing, and we've just reached the halfway point of the campaign, I have managed to kill 1 player, but just after they levelled up so that the cleric had resurrection could bring them back to life.
If I can I intercede at this point, because I feel there is an irreconcilable issue here. There's a difference between old school and new school gaming. The new school gamer will tend to say, I'm not trying. The new school GM will say, I'm not trying to kill them. We're trying to tell a story here. The old school GM will say, yeah, we're trying to tell a story, but if people die, it's their own stupid fault. The purpose of the GM in the old school is not so much to try and kill the players, but to act as referee in the conflict between players and rules system. The rules system is the challenge. It has the potential to kill players if they do something stupid.
Yes.
The players are therefore engaged in a challenge, not against the DM, but against the game itself. The DM is simply the arbitrator of that challenge and can decide to either make the challenge less challenging, but can not make it less challenging, but to mitigate it one way for the sake of story and say, no, I'm not going to kill anybody yet because it's not dramatically appropriate that they die and we're still trying to get something with this. Or to say, no, we roll it old school. Cark, 3 dice, 6 times in order, see you in 5 minutes. And which way is jumped there is largely down to player preference, but the conflict that's being mitigated by the GM is the same. Ali?
One of the things I do is simming. For those who aren't aware of it, it's like role-playing, it's online, but because you're not in the same room as people, it's effectively writing your chapter of the story in sequence.
Like a play-by-email thing, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the organisation I'm in has got quite a few games going, and I'm in the Stargate wing, and I run a Stargate sim, and the other Stargate sim is run by a guy who is about to join the Marines. His Stargate sim mostly consists of shooting people. And it's not just consisting of shooting people, but consisting of a double tap shot to make sure afterwards. Whereas my sim is quite a lot fluffier. Because I'm going, hang on, that never happened in Stargate. I'm trying to do a Stargate sim. I'm trying to do a sim that can go on at 7 o'clock in the evening and at 13-year-old. I don't know what you think you're doing, but it's not Stargate. So I hardly ever kill the leads, because that hardly ever happens in the story unless they can ascend and then come back again.
Several times.
Because I'm trying to be true to the
That's the
genre.
tension. That's the tension in action. I think between sort of story, but story as challenge. Because I'd stake my reputation that there is still conflict in your
and
games.
tons of Jeopardy. I love
Yeah.
shoving in Jeopardy.
Yeah.
But then it's in the show.
Exactly.
So that's
Yes,
what
but no. Yeah, but there isn't that immediate risk. There isn't that sort of round every corner somebody could die.
No.
Yeah.
Only at the right points in the show, just before the advert break.
Yeah.
But that's it. That's what you said about dramatically appropriate times. As a GM, we're crafting a story. There should be jeopardy for players, but the story is as important as the rules. And there is that worry that they will die.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Garrad. The story is not as important than the rules. The story is more important than the rules. I would rather fluff a rule completely
Actually,
to make sure the story.
To be fair, it depends on who you're playing. What some of your players. But,
As an old school
what
GM,
I mean
I say the game is more important than either the story or the rules. The experience of playing the game.
The experience of
is
coming
far
around
greater
having the
than anything
Chinese
else that goes
food
into it.
while you're playing.
actually,
the concept of
Yeah,
sitting
the
around.
entire concept of role playing can be summed up in Kung Po.
to be honest, for most of my groups that I play with, and I play with I do a lot of role play. It's an excuse to get together with a bunch of mates.
Yeah.
But as we're dealing with the story, there's the story, the jeopardy, and resolution. I do play with players. I think, I'm not really. I'm playing a lot of Sile at the moment. And I'm reaching the stage where some of my players, I'm going to have to drop a building on them to kill, to even scratch them. But I find when I talk to them, actually they're quite scared that they're going to lose their characters, despite the fact that in the whole 10-minute combat, not one of them got even near being hurt. So you can maintain that level of jeopardy without actually having to drop a building on them.
I quite concur. I mean, Rocks fall leg one dies is a terrible thing to do for group. I've only done it once. I've been running 30 hours straight, Nichols. I wanted a break.
I love that character.
Yeah, that's why I dropped an antediluvian and a mountain on her. I live to take away the things you love.
Graham's fasting.
Which is exactly, I mean, it's exactly how you're not supposed to do it, but I was a different person then. I was younger, stupider, and I hadn't slept for 30 hours. So, there was a hand over this Woodsley somewhere.
Yeah, to Sally's point about the Marine, I mean, the Marine will have a different set of filters and cultural inhibitions to, say, a civilian, because he's a trained killer.
Yeah, society is in the chair.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much the shooting will stop when he knows what it's
I think
actually
very
like.
probably most of it.
Is he a beta Marine or like a new one, fully effective?
Shiny new one.
So he's
He
in
hasn't
for,
actually.
He's got lots to learn,
yet.
hasn't
he's in for a horrible shotgun.
Yeah.
I mean,
He's gonna come
it
back a
suddenly
changed
cease
man,
to be a game.
hopefully.
It's about the story. But it's also about individual choice, because for people who say, I'm trying to tell a story, and are so controlling that they bind everybody into having to go a route, and you feel you don't like it anymore.
Yeah, there was a huge debate going around the old school revival blogs a while ago about the problem of the quantum ogre. If the GM really wants an ogre in this session, do that. And so you've got players that are standing at a crossroads. They come from that way. They can go 3 ways. GM really wants an ogre in this session. Does he say, doesn't matter which way you go, I'll put the ogre there, or does she say, no? If they turn left, they'll get the ogre. If they go that way, they'll get something else. If they go that way, they'll get something else.
I'll get the fluffy bunny. No.
Just a bunny.
I've actually done that. It's the fluffy bunny. You see a bunny sitting in the middle of a track. What are you going to do? And they're going. I don't know. It's a bunny. It's dinner. You haven't eaten for 2 days. It's a bunny. Eat it.
To be fair, Paul, it's like the gazebo.
You must face the gazebo alone.
Yes. Yeah, no, but I heard about it.
Yeah. But yeah, backtracking for a second. Yeah, society, much like with the author, society is in the DM chair with you. It's in the player chair with you.
there are going to be people in any given group of role players who would actually rather, just for once, the party could complete a mission without killing anybody, maybe. And there are people who don't actually think it's a successful mission unless a few people have got decapitated along the way. I worry about those people sometimes, but then... Okay, so we've talked a little bit about that possibility of the non-competitive versus non-confrontational game. I think things like role-playing games are non-confrontational because it tends to be all players against the system as mediated by the GM. Your straightforward war game or war game derivative is much more confrontational. Two players participating in a shared experience, somebody's going to win even if they don't care if they do or not. Okay, all of these potential motivations for gaming, escapism, winning, finding a solid rules set upon which to base some sort of assumption about reality, having fun, telling a good story, that all of these are potential motives which may be true and all of which may fit. I want now to turn to that interesting economic angle that we were looking up with, and this is where we start bringing in what Gary said and what, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, Chris said, is where we start bringing together some ideas about the economic models and of the various sort of rules for things that people come up with. And before we do that, I want to talk just for a second about genre, to introduce an idea. Darko Subin, in Metamorphoses of Science Fiction, says that science fiction is characterized by what he calls cognitive estrangement. It operates according to a rationalist or scientific mindset. It involves estrangement from the here and now so that it can extrapolate creatively. Loosely translated, just in case, like me, you have to turn that sentence around a couple of times to get your head around it, science fiction is fiction about science, about how societies react to a development in technology or worldview. I think that's what he's saying. Fantasy, in contrast, he used to argue, was, and I quote, a genre committed to the imposition of anti-cognitive laws into the empirical argument, a sub-literature of mystification. Subin's point of view is extremely reductionist, and I don't like the idea that you can say that a genre is exclusively about this, exclusively about that, exclusively a literature of one or the other. And if we've got time at the end, I would like to come back to that idea about sort of science fiction as forward-looking and fantasy essentially conservative, because I think it's an interesting one to knock on. But that point about mystification is what I'm driving towards, is the Marxist concept explained by John Berger in Ways of Seeing, of mystification. And Berger coined the term to describe the process of explaining away what might otherwise be evident, of obscuring the social processes in which work, art, games, people are embedded with airy blather and buzzwords and mysticism. When a complex social reality is overwritten with a straightforward good and evil opposition, even if it's done at the cause of allegory, Berger would say that's mystification. You're representing a social situation as simpler than it is. You're diverting attention from the way things are. And Berger, he said, fear of the present leads to mystification of the past. The past is not for living in. It is a well of conclusions from which we draw in order to act. Cultural mystification entails a double loss. Works of art are made unnecessarily remote, and the past offers us fewer conclusions to complete in action. What he's essentially saying there is that mystification is a policy of the powerful to prevent the powerless catching sight of the machinery of power, and thus finding a legitimate route out of their powerlessness. Like I said, you won't find many old-fashioned Marxists outside academia anymore. But actually, you know what? Let's do the fantasy thing now. Fantasy as literature of mystification. Fantasy as a way of... Because I mean, China Millville said in the same essay that there's epic fantasy tends to be about... you know, the problem with the king is that he's a bad king, as opposed to being a good king. The problem is not that there is a king at all. Does that make sense? Yeah? That it,
like fantasy about the problem being that he's a king.
Yeah. And a lot of people do. Millville himself does it. I mean, he was setting himself up against Subin's rather reductionist point of view and saying, well, hang on a second, there's a particular sort of post-Tolkienian epic that's about that.
But to say that the entire genre was about that, I mean, Millville said of his own work that the nicest thing anyone has ever said about it is that it reads like all fantasy would read in a parallel universe where it was Gormenghast and not Lord of the Rings that shaped over half the genre. And I remember somebody at a previous gathering like this in Plymouth saying to me that if you were there at the time, it was always Gormenghast or Lord of the Rings, that nobody liked both. Anyone who was there at the time care to speak up on this one, because I've always wanted to sort of verify that as a claim. That it was sort of an either-or notion at the time. It would have been late 40s, early 50s for... Okay. Okay.
Okay, depends on who's actually been Gormenghast. Yeah.
The first book is the one where nothing happens, but does so very interestingly. The third book is the one where Pete was dying of encephalitis, so it doesn't make any sense. The second one's the good one. I'd say start in the middle, jump back to the first one, and then if you're feeling brave, try the ending.
Although the TV thing,
the fourth one is real.
The castle and the weird thing.
Yeah, the TV adaptation is excellent, actually. I mean, considering the work that had to be done in compressing a volume of story that size into 2 hours, I thought it was superb. And I like the way that they didn't sink to a sort of overly gothicized look for it either, that it's gothic in the Victorian sense, that it's lurid and colourful, whilst at the same time being slightly macabre. They resisted the urge to make it all sort of grim, dark, and skulls on everything. And for that, I'll always respect the Beeb adaptation, I think. So, yeah, you can, as Marion was saying, write fantasy that isn't like that. And what Dubin's reacting against is that sort of Tolkien, Brooks, Hoc Generis Omne, school of thought where it's divine right of kings, usually great men of genius. The Wheel of Time does this a little bit as well, but if you're not the chosen one, there's not really any point in turning up. So, now, considering that sort of idea about, I got to thinking about gaming as mystification and of immersing yourself in a fictional world or an artificial rules system, and of this being presented as a distraction from legitimate political activity. Then I decided not to think about that because it was getting a bit depressing, and I thought I could be off starting a revolution instead of playing D&D. Yeah, but I wouldn't get shot at if I was playing D&D. So,
Well, you might.
But you wouldn't hurt.
Yes, well, I mean, although to be fair, I have at least had one player punch me in the face before. I know she's left the room now that the story comes out, but it was only the once, and I probably deserved it. But
do men need, and I'll say specifically men probably, do men need violent games because violence isn't allowed in real life anymore? Does it have to be there to let the testosterone?
I don't know. I would be tempted. I don't want to say yes, because the thing is, I've played RPGs that have no physical conflict in them. I do play World of Warcraft, but I tend to play healers. So it's either possible that not all men do, or that I'm not a real man.
You still have to kill the spiders, don't you? No matter what the hell you are.
No, I have other people to kill my spiders for me. Other people kill the spiders, I just stop the spiders killing them.
Oh, right.
I think it appeals to a more physical sense of dominance over one particular creature or item, or anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like excuse me. A game basically is your playground. You can do what you want with it, particularly in the pixel land anyway. Yeah. I've played Call of Duty online, and I can tell you the blood rush some 12-year-olds get on the other end of the headset is very scary.
Yeah, I think there may be some truth in it. I'm not necessarily going to say men, but I'm going to say because people whose idea of a challenge is overcoming some physical opponent will probably it's probably the closest they're going to get to actually being able to go out and stab a wild boar in the head. You know, we don't go chasing. Well, I don't know. Maybe some of us do go chasing through the war hunting wild boar at weekends. If so, can I come? It's so much fun.
Well, it's equivalent to the John Wayne fan who never been to America, never actually been to Wild West, but likes to walk around wearing chaps.
Moving swiftly on from the chaps.
We've got two friends, a married couple who play World of Warcraft. He is a healer and as non-violent as you can get. She kills things with relish. I mean, she's 4'11" and a half, and she is probably the most violent person online that you'll ever meet. But in everyday life, she's quite. Well, I'm saying
she was in the
army. I think it's a type of person that
she wanted to be in the army. She
but,
wanted to be a military policeman, but she was too short.
Too much. That's exactly what she was.
It's a good ringtone, so I'll let it on.
Sorry.
One of the things I found when I used to engage in tabletop campaigns and sort of D&D and that, was I got the general impression that not just in violence, but in other respects, it did allow people to allow out, to act out things that they would never normally dream of doing and that wouldn't be socially acceptable.
Yes, there is something about role-playing games that tends to bring out the sociopath in some people.
Yeah.
I once ran a World of Darkness game where one of the first things that I remember a character doing after being turned into a vampire was to go off and shoot someone they'd always hated in the head, because they felt they were above the law now. And there is that sort of sense. I mean, I'm going to talk for a bit about D&D because I think you're onto something with this idea that there's something that is impossible or not permitted or not accepted in real life. And this is the bit where
Can't have the good things as well, because in real life you can't be James Bond because James Bond does things that real human beings can't do. He cheats, basically. But in a game you could be James Bond and you could save the world from a supervillain with a nuclear missile. And, I
think that's ultimately the great appeal of it, that you can do things that you can do things that you couldn't normally do, and you can make more of a difference than you might normally be able to make. I think. And as a sort of... Oh, sorry, Ali.
I was wondering if there's some kind of karmic balance in it, because what I've found is over the years of gaming, as I've, in my real life, progressed up the management chain, I'm going down in the games. Because when I was a junior programmer, I was delighted to play the captain of a spaceship. Now I'm a team leader, I'd much rather be a lieutenant and just sort of faff around a bit and occasionally set the traps off just for fun.
I think it's also, as you get older and more experienced, you have less to prove. When you're young, you want to be the captain, you want to prove how good you are. Once you get to our stage of going, you know what, I really don't care, I don't have anything left to prove. Let the youngsters go off. I'll just be there and cause problems.
You go defuse the bomb, I'll be over here.
Yeah, you can go and save the world. What do you want me to do, boys?
I'll make some stuff.
I'll
say you don't want to do that.
A brief case study of this sort of thing. I'll have a quick deco at the original Dungeons and Dragons, which
back in the mists of time.
I'm going to take you on a trip to 1974.
Yes.
Or thereabouts. You have the post-Altamont burnout. The 60s are over. The hippie dream has proven to be a bit of an embarrassment. Hunter S. Thompson is riding high, weeping into his speedballs, running headlong into the emergence of Nixon republicanism, of an increasingly right-wing USA. In the middle of all that, here's Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and they're producing something which various people have read variously, that was a completely legitimate sentence, honestly, as a game of manifest destiny, harkening back to the good old days of settled America, when you've got wilderness, miles upon miles of untamed wilderness with ravenous beasties, the like of which you've never before seen in your life. There's something out there, let's go and tame this land. And there's an element of that in the original D&D. We return to the accusations levelled against Tolkien by Melville, Michael Moorcock and others that Tolkien uses the orcs and the men of the South as this unpleasant allegory for foreigners and members of the working class. And the argument that D&D is in a lot of ways race war, the game, that you go off and you kill orcs. Why? Because they're orcs. They're there for killing.
It's colonialism. You kill people and you take their stuff.
Pig-nosed grey bastards. You have the rather Marxist viewpoint that game writer Zach Sabbath came out with, which was the when you're sitting down making a D&D character, and if you've had a sort of arts and humanities education, just for a second you hear race, class and level, and your brain ticks into Marx mode for a second, and then you suddenly remember that you're playing D&D and that it's not actually a taxonomy of where you are in society and exactly what you're capable of and allowed to do. And then you have the original end game of D&D, which is something I didn't know about until quite recently, but in at least one early iteration of the game, the end game for each of the playable classes was feudal land ownership. The fighter settles down, builds a castle, recruits men at arms, becomes a feudal lord, collects tithes, protects the land against all them ravening grey hooligans up there in the hills. The wizard goes off and builds a tower somewhere and takes on apprentices and sets up this little knowledge economy and sells scrolls to little wizards for a living so that they don't die on their first adventure. Not that I'm bitter or anything, but magic users are really hard to play in first edition. And the cleric goes off and starts a temple and accumulates converts and so on and so forth. And this sort of endgame of feudal land ownership struck a chord with me because the investment of time, money and effort in anything creates the expectation of reward. And this is what clued me into an antecedent for the modern Memorpia, in which a lot of MMORPGs feel to me a lot like work. And again, I play WoW, so I'm not just having a swing at it because it's there. But the end game is achievement hunting and grinding and daily questing and unlockable content and doing the same stuff over and over again for the good of the guild. That's like work. EVE players have got it even worse. Apparently they have to use spreadsheets.
American dream.
I mean, World of Warcraft, being as it is essentially Diablo 2 with a social network grafted onto it, is possibly the most addictive thing ever devised by man. But it makes me wonder how much of these games are sort of fantasies of work and working. The idea that if you put your time in, you'll get something that belongs to you. And in the old D&D, you clawed your way up through those 8 or 9 levels, and then by level 10 you'd have a castle to call your own, and would never have to bow your head to man or beast again. Whereas
isn't D&D consumerism gone mad as well? Because your character in D&D doesn't get better because they physically or mentally improve. It's because you're carrying more stuff.
It's certainly in the first edition where experience is equal to the amount of gold spent.
Yeah.
It's gold experience. And I suppose the idea is it's a story motivator. I think Gygax would say it's a story motivator that if they have to spend their money to get the XP, they'll always be poor, so they'll always want to go on more adventures. And I agree that there's a consumerist aspect to it, but then sometimes I look at the new school games where there isn't a reason to spend all that money. I mean, one of my Warcraft characters is sitting on about 5,000 gold pieces, more shiny objects than she knows what to do with, and I've got no idea what to do with it now because she's there, she's level 85, she's been there, seen it all, done it all, been everywhere at least once, and the expectation seems to be the end game keeps going day in, day out, and that's when it gets into that sort of second job you have to pay for. I don't understand. I understand the end game of original D&D, even if it does have that sort of, it has the overtone that the academic training revolts against slightly. I can only project and try to guess what the appeal is in games that are like going to a job and doing the daily grind. You know, they call it grind for a reason. Just out of interest, this is an area of gaming that I've never gotten into, is the Facebook games, things like Farmville and so on. Who plays Farmville or something similar? Similar, yeah. Something where you're going off and recruiting people.
It makes my mind go blank at the end of the day. It releases me from the grind of work to do something completely mindless because part of my work uses my mind and my memory, and this activity doesn't. So it helps me to shut down at the end of the day of work.
Okay. I would feel like I was trading one kind of grind for another.
No, because yes you are in some ways, but if it helps you to shut off, to allow you to do the things you love after 10 minutes of sorting that out, doing that, right, that's off, right, done that, that's set up for next time and coming back to it, then it allows me to break.
Yes, it's kind of a break point, a sort of catharsis thing,
But like some people have mantras.
Yeah. Ah, so yeah, so it's almost like sort of meditation through gameplay.
Exactly. And games where you know that diner thing where you're shooting eggs, and you sit there and you think, I'll just play this for 10 minutes and an hour
Is that going back to Crawford's dichotomy for a second? Is that a game, or is that a puzzle, or is that a plaything, or what is it? Does it have an end? Does it have an end goal, or is it just a plaything? Yeah, so there's a goal there if you want it, but you can just play it for brain steam. So yeah, that's something that works on multiple levels of Crawford's little hierarchy, because it's either a plaything or a game, depending how seriously you take it. That's interesting. And it reminds me of something else that Zach Sabbath said with Ref D&D, that when he's running D&D, the nature of his job is such that running D&D might be the first time that his brain's had to work hard in 48 hours. So it might be almost kind of the other way round, that if you don't have to engage the old grey matter that much while you're working, that suddenly going off and GMing and doing it by the seat of your pants and making it up as you go along, suddenly you have to use all that stuff in your head for something. Okay. A few final thoughts then. You've got that, so I mean, we described sort of D&D as consumerism gone mad, and I've brought up that idea of mystification and of the game as distraction from legitimate political activity. And what I'm going to ask now is there a game that doesn't mystify? Or is the simple act of playing the game an act of mystification, distracting yourself from the way things really are?
I'm always mystified by games.
I'm mystified by everything, so...
If it has a defined rule set, you can go and say, well actually it says here, if you do A, B happens. Yeah. You have made it simpler than real life.
Yeah, the rules of games are seldom mystified unless they're appallingly written. I'd like to say they're getting better, but it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, really.
Uber super swaddling, etc.
It surely depends on whether you're playing a game with or against somebody else, or whether you're playing a game that doesn't involve another human being, because that will make a big difference. What do human beings have their big brains for, except for dealing with other human beings?
Interesting, yeah. Scott Barber, the competitive wargamer chap, he always said that he hated single-player games, because as far as he was concerned, that's not a game. It's a game if there's somebody else involved, and you're either collaborating with them to overcome something else, or you're trying to overcome them. That in some way you're interacting with another person. He wasn't a storytelling type person, but I imagine there's what our friend at the back from the Sad Muppet Society. I'm sorry. Paul. Hi, Paul. I imagine, or something like Paul was saying, where the point is that conversation that happens through the mechanics, but that there's some sort of interactivity involved. World of Warcraft, I know a great many people, my better half amongst them, who play it largely as a chat window that happens to have a game running in the background. So, yeah?
I find that I'm far more competitive against myself than I ever am against somebody else.
Yeah.
And for that, in that respect, single-player games are far more intense to me than a game with other players.
Yeah.
See, I don't get that, because if I'm playing against myself and I beat myself, I'm still lost.
You've also won, yeah. But if you're playing against other people, I'm quite happy to be stomped on by anybody, but I know it's irrational. I always get if I am too successful, I always feel bad about it.
It's what Yahtzee Croshaw calls having half a competitive streak. The unfortunate situation where you hate losing, but you don't particularly care about winning.
Yeah, I would go on with that. Yeah, I hate losing, and I don't want to do it. I want to find a way of avoiding it next time. But at the same time, I'm quite happy too.
Yeah. Speaking entirely personally, I don't mind getting beaten, but I hate losing.
Yes.
If my own stupidity costs me a win, I'm furious.
Oh, yeah.
But if I'm flat out outplayed, if I'm outthought and outmanoeuvred by a superior opponent,
then that's a lovely game.
Like, for instance, the plug in the hotel room, was beaten fair and square this morning, then, hats off to that plug. That plug did a good job. Voice in the front, sorry.
Yes, of course, as usual, the argument's moved on several points. But to me, one of the most important aspects of gameplay is that I'm with other people, it's the social interaction. And, you know, I don't know, we're probably going to get onto the anti-games brigade at one time. I don't know if you remember the Hungerford Massacre of Michael Ryan, and he was into role-playing games, but the thing that none of the newspapers brought forward was that he played alone, he played it removed by, I don't think there was much less computer, or by mail. He never interacted with other people. And it's the social interaction, to me, that is the important part of games.
This is what I have always said, particularly in response to the whole satanic panic thing that surrounded TSR in the 80s as well, that games do not make monsters. They might bring out the monster in someone, but it's like that guns don't kill people, bullets kill people. Games don't make monsters. Monsters play games. I wasn't going to touch on the anti-game lobby, but since it's up, any more thoughts on that?
Only it's a cheap single issue thing.
It's just lazy.
About cheese and watch the news and read the Daily Mail and wore shoes and all sorts of other things.
I have to say, after reading the Daily Mail, I personally want to go on and bury a crowbar in somebody as well. Possibly myself, having picked it up in the first place.
I've always thought that if watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre is supposed to bring out the violence inherent in you, how come the British Board of Censors hasn't killed everybody?
It's the same chap, Quentin What's-His-Face, that's been signing the certificates for all these years. He must be about 100. He must be about 103. I'm not sure he can kill anyone. Maybe that's it. Maybe they just sort of wheel him out of his cage to froth and twitch a bit and sign off the certificate, and then they wheel him back in again. I don't know.
He has a network of minions.
Ah, right. He's got minions to do that for him. Was there ever a Quentin? Or is it just like a preserved head in a jar or something? It's a statue in the office.
Yeah, big rubbish. He could be the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Well, any of us could be the Dread Pirate Roberts. The Dread Pirate Roberts could be anywhere.
Precisely. But that's the point. It is just a name.
Yeah.
It could just be a name, but always gets signed.
But sure it is. It's good to pick as well, Quentin. You're always going to think that's a real person because you don't see many Quentins.
But you'd always like to meet one.
I've met one.
Please.
I was actually very surprised to discover that there are Quentins still alive and free in the world. But there we are. I mean, that's our idea of games as social misfits, gaming and social misfits as well. I've never quite bought onto that one.
No, definitely not. It's like I do not play video games where it is just me against the computer. I will only play games which require an opponent or at least the interaction, as I said, of somebody across a table, across the internet to play somebody. I do not play single player games because I just find them so dull. If I've got time to sit down and play a single player game, I'd rather go out and do something slightly more interesting.
Yeah, if you've got time to play Baldur's Gate, you've got time to write a D&D campaign.
Yes, precisely. I've got a campaign to write. I could go out for a walk, stick the MP3 player on, and go for a 10-mile hike rather than sit down and pick up and stick a computer game into the machine and go, oh look, I'm now going to spend 2 hours playing against the computer and myself.
Yeah. Playing with yourself, even.
Single player campaigns are meant to be competitive and then to be a narrative journey that you follow just like a TV or book.
The thing is, that narrative journey can be taken cooperative, though. If you've got the time to play single player, get someone else around and play co-op. Because at least then there'll be 2 people going on the narrative journey together, heckling it.
Yes.
Okay.
On the social misfits thing, isn't that just labelling? Because if you spend your Saturday afternoon with some mates playing board games, you are a social misfit. If you spend your Saturday afternoon with your mates going to a football match and then you smash the opposition's head in down the pub afterwards, you're not the social misfit, even though it's far more socially unacceptable. Ben
Elton, of all people, did a skit that entirely agreed with that one, and I'm with you too, to be honest. That I've never quite understood why some activities which are far more likely to provoke intense physical violence get so much good press?
They make more money.
Absolutely. I mean,
Why do they make more money?
Because people like bashing each other's heads.
not only that, not only that, but
industries like newspapers.
There's a chap called Mike Dickinson that I used to know. He's an opinionated man, our Mike, and since I'm quite opinionated as well, we shared many full and forthright views. And one of the views that he shared with me was that the notion of particular role-playing industry is bunk. Because once you have got, in fact, a short demonstration, once you have got this book, you have got a role-playing game. You do not need the 20 others that might have been produced by the same publisher, although Tides of Akai informed me that they won't, that it's going to be 6 books and only one that you actually need. But you do not need the shelf of supplementary materials to play. All that stuff only exists to keep gaming companies in business. The fact is that certainly for role-playing, I think to an extent to the Euro games as well, things like Dominion that have, I mean, Dominion's not too bad for it, but games that expand forever, most of the add-on stuff is only there for the purpose of keeping the company in business. Gaming doesn't need to make money, and making money out of gaming is largely about creating a market for things that are not essential for the playing of games. Just sort of wrap up, there was something that Mark said that I'd like to go back to briefly. Is the Second World War in particular, but the first-person shooter, the genres that are largely detached from the whole question of fantasy or science fiction or what have you. Real-world games, how do they fit in? Games that are set in the real world, historical games, historical war games, Call of Duty.
Call of Duty, it's really, escapism is most extreme. I mean, there's basically people who want to do this, who think this is my calling, I will be a soldier, but can never actually bring themselves to sign up and go and fight. And so they live out this fantasy world where they're playing this game, they are actually making a difference, they are actually a soldier fighting for freedom. But if they went anywhere near a gun, they'd probably empty their barrels faster than...
One theory that did around a while ago was that it was a kind of power fantasy. There was a kind of power fantasy as well. That there are enemies. The conflict is clear. There are enemies to vanquish. Let's get on with it. You don't have to sit around puzzling out what the problem is. The problem is that there's a bloke in that building over there who's shooting at you. And that was ultimately where I was planning to conclude this whole sort of detour through games and economies. The idea that games, no matter how complex the game, it's still simpler than reality, or at the very least that you've still got a rule book for it. And I think ultimately that's not the whole attraction, but that it's definitely a big part of what brings these things in. But the social element was brought up and cannot be ignored, and I'm going to conclude with some more paraphrased words of wisdom from Zach Sabbath. The idea that you have the story that's being told in the game, and you have the sort of sustained epic narrative of heroism and conquest. You have the mechanics of the game, the actual rolling of dice and rolling higher numbers than each other and beating the system. And then quite incidental to all that, you have the experience of playing the game itself. And as far as the arch-old schooler, is concerned, the point of social games like D&D, like war games, it's not so much to be able to tell the story of your game at the end, to collar someone in a bar and tell them about your 18th level paladin, but to create a story that will never be retold, because when it's over, it's gone, it's ephemeral. That social experience of actually playing the game right there, right now, is far, far more important than any mechanics, any grand narrative, any sense of social mystification, and any sense that we could all be off changing the world, because you can't change the world all the time. Even socialists need a day off. Thank you very much.